Welcome to Racing Green live from Earthfest 2024. Today our guest host, Elizabeth Course, chats with Tessa Clarke, co-founder and CEO of Olio. Together they unpack how Olio's app helps 7 million users fight food waste by enabling local sharing. The conversation unveils the huge environmental impact of food waste, how small changes at home and work can make a huge difference, and the critical role of community and businesses in building a sustainable future.
Hello everybody. Welcome to Earthfest. We are thrilled to have a live audience as well as our listeners at home. And today is a very special day because it's the inaugural Earthfest right here in King's Cross. And today at Racing Green Live, I am joined by someone who's going to help us talk about innovating against food waste. And this guest believes that we must learn to consume differently by sharing more at home, but also at work. And along with her co-founder, they created Olio, which is a local sharing app that has seen over 165 million portions of food and 12 million household items shared. So Olio now has 7 million users and has really helped show how technology can help create a community spirit, can help nudge behavior, but more importantly, how business can get involved. So please put it together for our guest, Tessa Clarke from Olio. Now, you've actually already been on this podcast once before at Racing Green. Guilty as charged. So I do encourage anybody listening to this can obviously go and listen to that as well. But let's start first with, what are the environmental problems of food waste specifically? How big is the problem? And where does it actually take place, in society? Is it in the home? Is it in work? And how does that split happen?
Okay, a lot to cover there.
A lot to cover.
Right. It is no exaggeration to say that food waste is one of the largest problems facing humanity today, and it's also a problem that's hiding in plain sight. Unfortunately, we're just not talking about it. So to put it into context, globally, a third of all the food we produce each year gets thrown away, which is worth over $1 trillion. And the environmental impact of that is absolutely devastating. So if it were to be a country, food waste would be the third largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after the USA and China. And you might wonder why? How on earth can food and food waste, something that sort of comes from the soil, be so detrimental to the planet? And the reason for that is because a landmass larger than China is used every single year to grow food that is never eaten. So that is all that land that has been deforested, the soil has been degraded, the species driven to extinction, a quarter of humanity's fresh water is used to grow food that is never eaten. That food then goes on an enormously long supply chain with all the packaging, manufacturing, refrigeration, distribution. And then when a third of it gets thrown away, sadly, the vast majority of it ends up in landfill. And when food decomposes without access to oxygen, it creates methane, which is over 25 times more deadly than CO2. So to put the climate impact of food waste into context with some other sectors that you might be familiar with, the greenhouse gas emissions from food waste alone represent 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that is more than the whole entire fashion industry, and it is 5 times the emissions from the aviation industry. So hopefully I've now hammered home that point that food waste is a really, really big problem. So now let's kind of dig into where does it take place. So I hate this terminology, but if we looked at sort of developed, quote unquote, countries, then the majority of food waste takes place with the consumer in the home. And if you look at, quote unquote, developing countries, the majority of the food waste takes place sort of on the farm and through the distribution process. So if we look at a country such as the UK, the latest data that WRAP have just released, which is the government body that measures this sort of thing, their latest data shows that 60% of all food waste here in the UK takes place in the home. Now, that's super counterintuitive to most people, because most people, when you talk about food waste, they say, oh, it must be the supermarkets. Unfortunately, that is wrong. So just 2% of all food waste in the UK is generated at a retail location. And the reason for that is simple maths. There's 28 million households throwing away roughly 20% in the weekly shop, in contrast to thousands of stores throwing away half a percentage point. So we've got 60% in the home, 2% at a retail store location. We've then got 10% in hospitality and food service. And this is where my memory probably fails me a little bit. I think it's 13% in manufacturing and distribution, and it's 15% at the farm gate. So the real kind of message of that is that it's us in our homes. That is where the largest problem is. But the most visible element of the problem is at a retail and hospitality and food service level.
So you've obviously made food waste your personal mission. And I'm assuming that being an entrepreneur, and maybe even known as a climate tech entrepreneur, was probably not on your career path at school. Now, I know you grew up as a farmer's daughter. Yeah. Maybe take us through a little bit of how that arc goes. Yeah. And why you've ended up, you've been doing Olio for about 8 years now. So how did you get to that point?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. I grew up with my 2 younger brothers on our family farm, where we're still farming today up in North Yorkshire. We were put to work pretty much as soon as we could walk and carry a bucket. We were immediately enrolled into the family workforce and would be literally kind of farming with the animals on the land, and that was how all of our weekends were spent, all of our family holidays. And through that experience, you realise just how much hard work goes into producing the food we all eat every day. So I definitely grew up with this sense that food waste is absolutely criminal. It just did not happen in my home. I didn't sort of think anything in particular about that. Certainly, as I was thinking about my career as I was growing up, I had absolutely no clue what I wanted to do. I was always very envious of those people who knew from a very young age what they wanted to do. The only thing I knew I didn't want to do was I knew I didn't want to be a farmer or a farmer's wife. So that was ruled out. I then pursued, I went to Cambridge, studied social and political sciences, and I think that's where I'm very interested in kind of systems and people and the environment and technology and the intersection of all that. Still had no clue what I wanted to do. So I then did a couple of years in strategy consulting. I then moved over into industry, and I was always working in the digital space in a general management role, and I worked in media, retail, financial services. And even by the end of all of that, I was none the wiser about what I wanted to do when I grew up. And it's only since I founded Olio that I have finally found out what I want to do now that I'm a grown-up.
I think that's probably something that a lot of us share, and it's often only when you have arrived at a point that you can piece and kind of thread the pieces together. Yep. But you have now found yourself in a position where you are scaling, a British brand that is getting lots of recognition. It's probably doesn't feel like overnight, but it's certainly something that is growing and is building a real movement around something that you really care about, which is food waste. And so can you talk to us about how you create a business that has impact, makes people feel like special for being part of the movement, and also that makes revenue? And I'm conscious not everybody here or listening at home will necessarily know what the app is, so maybe start with that a little bit as well, and how you then make that into a business that has impact but also has profit.
Certainly. So Olio exists to solve the climate crisis by connecting people with their neighbours so they can give away rather than throw away their spare food and other household items. We're really, really rooted in community, local community, about connecting people, neighbours, on the doorstep to share, get people sharing instead of shopping. And how the app works is you just snap a photo of your surplus item of food or toiletry that you don't want. You add it to Olio. People living nearby get an alert. They can browse the listings, request what they want, and pop round and pick it up. When we launched Olio, we saw it really as sort of a waste prevention tool. What we learned within the first week is that actually it's a community building tool. People join Olio because they hate waste. They keep using Olio because they love that feel-good factor of giving something a second life and meeting someone in their local community. We have often been asked, sort of, why did we set up Olio as a business? Because there is such a strong assumption, certainly here in the UK, that if you're doing something good, you must surely be a charity. And people kind of scratch their heads a little bit at Olio. They don't understand why we're not a charity. And Sasha, my co-founder, and I were extremely clear from day one that Olio needed to be a business. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first one was that the urgency with which the climate crisis needs solving and the problem of food waste within that cannot be overstated. And we hadn't seen any charity scale globally as quickly as Google or Facebook or Airbnb or Spotify, kind of take your pick. So it was very clear to us that sort of being a business was going to be the most effective way for us to have as big an impact as quickly as possible. The other reason is why we chose to be a business is that neither Sasha nor I had any experience or heritage of working in the charitable sector. We didn't have a clue, whereas we had got business experience. So for both those reasons, it made sense for Olio to be a business. We get really quite frustrated with the current dichotomy that exists here in the UK at the moment, where there's an assumption that if you're doing good, you must be a charity, and if you're scaling and growing fast, you must be a business. We're really trying to pave this third path, which is profit with purpose. And we believe that that will be the new model of business. We believe that, ideally it'll be within the next decade, maybe two, that any business that doesn't have purpose at its core will lose the license to exist.
And that is a very powerful story for anybody that is part of that journey, because you really are doing hitting all the things you don't want, in the sense of you don't like food waste. You're meeting your community, and you're supporting something that has purpose at its very heart. And what I'd like to understand now is, where can business, because we all go to work, so we have our home lives, but we go to work. And in fact, one of my favorite stories is being at an event that was catered. Everybody left. All the food that was uneaten was left in full, and I could not go home with this food, already laying out. So I didn't know about Olio at the time, so we ended up taking it to the local Samaritans building. But it took someone to really look at that, but I was in a work context and in a work setting. Can you tell us a little bit about how you can involve business in that framework, and how I can, as a green champion, can come in and use Olio to help me do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we see this very frequently. People will be using Olio in their home life to share their surplus, and then they go to work, and sort of what they're throwing away in their home is dwarfed by the waste that they see at work. And in particular, given that we've got the cost of living crisis going on, it's becoming even more galling for people to see perfectly good food being thrown away when we have 10 million people in this country living in food poverty, 4 million of whom are children. And so employees are, thankfully, increasingly challenging their employers. So too are customers. And this is incredibly helpful. And it's this social element, actually, that is really driving people to challenge these businesses. And whilst Olio, we kind of exist for the environmental purpose, we're actually very, very happy. Whatever is people's motivator, we don't care, so long as we just get that food redistributed. And we started working with businesses fairly early on in our life, because we found ourselves in a very, very challenging conundrum in our early days. So the early adopters hated food waste. They loved Olio, but because they hated food waste, they didn't actually have any surplus food to share. And then we had started trying to work with coffee shops, bakeries, delis. We had hoped that they would use the Olio app to put their unsold food onto the app at the end of the day, bring extra traffic into the store. They could cross-sell, upsell. It'd be fantastic for their brand. And we found that they were far too busy running their day-to-day business to be messing around with an app, messaging with a whole load of people who lived in the local community. So we were a food sharing app with no food, which, as I'm sure you'll agree, is pretty useless. So how we solved that, we said, well, why don't we take these people who have lots of time, but no food waste, and match them up with these businesses that don't have time, but have an awful lot of food waste. And through that, we created our Food Waste Heroes program. So today we have 100,000 volunteers across the UK. These are people who we we recruit from our community. We train them on our food safety management system. And then once you're a trained food waste hero, you can claim a collection slot. And a collection slot is an opportunity to go to a local business that has signed up with Olio. You will pick up all of their unsold or unserved food. You will take it home, you will add it to the app, and within minutes your neighbours are popping round and picking up that food. So that takes that food from being considered a waste stream in the business to within 1 to 2 hours being fully redistributed into multiple homes in the local community. And we are working with supermarkets, with corporate canteens, school canteens, hospital canteens, film and TV production shoots, anywhere where there's a business locally that has surplus food, our volunteers will spring into action and redistribute that. So on any 1 week, there'll be 10,000 people sort of leaving their homes and collecting this food and making sure that their local community is getting to benefit from it and get to eat it.
And that's just an incredible impact because, of course, for the businesses in those regions, you're then also tapping into all of the social impact that you may have on your agenda as well. So talk us through what are the drivers for businesses to do this? Because, is this something that they can shout about, without the fear of greenwashing, which is obviously a big issue now? Is this something that they can stand out and be proud of? Is this something that you see that they do because they waste less money? Like, what are some of the drivers you're seeing in the businesses where this is set up?
So businesses work with Olio for a variety of reasons. Their employees are getting increasingly frustrated that they are being paid to throw away perfectly good food when they are as aware as anyone that we have a cost of living crisis going on. Their customers are calling them out on social media when they see those clear bin bags out on the street showing all that perfectly good food being thrown away. And also increasingly, organizations have now sustainability teams, ESG teams. They have net zero targets that in order to achieve those targets, they absolutely need to make sure that they stop throwing away perfectly good food. At the moment, businesses are paying waste contractors to take that food off to waste streams, and instead they're now paying Olio to make sure that that food is shared in the local community. And we then give back to those businesses their impact data. So we're able to tell them how many families have benefited from their food, how many tons of food have been saved, what the carbon emissions of that is, how many litres of water have been saved. We give them testimonials. And then absolutely, we very much encourage this. They then go on to promote that to their employees and to their customers in their offices and in their stores. And they get a really, really positive feedback. It's a very powerful statement to say we are a zero food waste location.
Yeah, so not only does it look good in an impact report, it actually makes your team and your workforce feel very good about being there. And it's very tangible, it's very visible, isn't it?
Yeah, and it also brings new customers to your business as well. So people will often tell us that they try food on Olio, either from a store or a type of food that they would never have otherwise dreamed of experimenting with. But given that it's available and it's free, why not? So it also helps put your brand and your products in front of a new audience as well.
Which is not an angle that I would have thought of. That seems like a win-win. Now, this seems straightforward. So why isn't every business doing this? Is it because they haven't heard of you? Is it because there's maybe a block at the leadership level? Like what are the challenges that kind of blocks this happening?
Good question. I would say that prior to 3 years ago, it really was a lack of awareness challenge. In the last couple of years, our major blocker is the fact that businesses are just firefighting on every single front. They're dealing with supply chain crises. They're dealing with the cost of living crisis. They're dealing with the fact that their price of debt has gone up. And unfortunately, because food waste takes place behind closed doors, it's not an immediate priority for them to solve that problem. Now, something we are very, very excited about is regulation coming into this space. So in many countries around the world, there are consultations underway to bring in regulation to strongly encourage businesses to redistribute their surplus food. What that looks like here in the UK is there's been a consultation that will mandate all large businesses to publish their food waste data publicly. So that will then take that food waste out from behind closed doors and they will put it out into the public. And I'm reminded of that expression that sunlight is the best form of disinfectant. So I'm very, very hopeful that this regulation, which feels like it's very, very imminent, will really help accelerate the redistribution of the surplus food. Also, I do think that the growing awareness of child hunger will help as well. So, for example, there was an initiative launched by Cherie Blair, I think it was earlier on this week. There's a plan to try and lift 1 million children out of poverty, and food poverty is a very, very large part of that. And I think as we start raising the awareness of just how many children are going hungry in this country, I believe there will be more and more pressure on businesses to redistribute that surplus food rather than just continue to send it off to waste streams.
Especially because there's such a direct connection between where you're based as your sites and then being able to support the local community immediately around it.
Absolutely. And it has a really, really positive brand impact, halo effect. So we've done research that shows, so Tesco, for example, is one of our largest partners, and people who have experienced the Tesco food via the Olio app say that they are 80%, 80% of them are more likely to shop at a Tesco because Tesco is working with Olio, because Tesco is being responsible in that way and redistributing their surplus food.
So you mentioned, obviously, the push of regulation, and there's always that uncomfortableness between, what's going to drive the change? Is it consumers? Is it business? Is it government? Now, where I think business can really play an important part, and of course, it's always a touchy subject, do you call it lobbying? Do you call it advocacy? But ultimately, there is a circle of influence. Now, I assume Olio is not on its own trying to encourage this extra sunlight to shine a light on what is going on with food waste. Can you tell us a bit about kind of the industry? Like, is there an industry for food waste? What does that look like? And how are you able to advocate for the changes you need to see at kind of a regulatory level, whether it's in the UK and beyond? What does that look like at the moment?
So on the regulatory piece, there's an absolutely fantastic organisation called Feedback. They are a campaigning group that have lots of research and lots of activities underway to try and address the problem of food waste. And they are really spearheading, on behalf of the wider industry, the application of pressure to the policymakers around this food waste regulation. They're a really, really incredible organisation. You've then got the charitable sector. The largest player there is FareShare, who redistribute to about 10,000 charities. They're one of our partners, so we work together with them at a number of clients. And our policy is always that charities should have access to whatever food they want first, and then the local community, via our Food Waste Heroes, will step in and collect and redistribute all of the surplus food that's left over. Charities don't have the capacity to collect and redistribute all of the surplus food that businesses are generating. So businesses in the UK are throwing away over 2 billion meals worth of perfectly good food every single year. And a lot of it is food that, for one reason or another, isn't well suited to the charitable model of redistribution. So that might be food that's after its best before date. That might be hot food or chilled food or frozen food. That might be food that's got a use by date of today, which means it's got to be redistributed by midnight and the store's closing at 9 or 10 o'clock. So you haven't got time to put it through a logistics supply chain. It just needs to be redistributed locally. So we work very much hand in hand with the charitable sector. So there's FareShare, there's the Felix Project, there's Food Cycle, who take surplus food and turn it into community-based meals. There are a lot of really, really wonderful organisations in the food waste or food redistribution, as we prefer to call it, space.
food redistribution. That is going to be part of my new lingo, food distribution. So in terms of, you've talked about there's a lot of grassroots movements. You are getting great traction with, the likes of Tesco's and big businesses like that. And so I guess you are in the rooms at boardroom level where conversations are happening. And as you say, there's a lot of firefighting. What are you seeing, in terms of conversations now in 2024 when it comes to sustainability and then also waste? What is your sense? Are you seeing any trends, or does it really just vary on the industry, the leadership? What are you seeing?
So whilst business has clearly not moved anywhere near fast enough to solve the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and resource depletion crisis, I am feeling optimistic because I can see what is happening behind the scenes, and change is absolutely happening. So a couple of years ago, the concept of a chief sustainability officer didn't really exist, whereas now pretty much every large organization worth its salt does have a CSO who has a team, and they are increasingly having the ear of the CEO, the ear of the board. I think not as much as they would like. Mm-hmm. And I see a lot of initiatives are underway. Unfortunately, though, having spoken to a lot of CSOs, they say, and we're experiencing this as well, that since the war in Ukraine broke out in the beginning of 2022, and that then sort of kicked off that wider macroeconomic challenge, sustainability has unfortunately dropped down the corporate agenda. And I would say that sort of prior to that, sustainability was for many organizations a top 3, a top 5 priority. Unfortunately, now it is not. That is deeply concerning because precisely at the time when we need business to be stepping forward and accelerating their efforts, they are not.
And I think it's important to address it because I think it can be easy to say, no, sustainability is still up there. And actually, when it's not, it's actually not helpful. So actually saying, again, shining the light on the fact that it has changed. Now, are you seeing, I guess you're looking at quicker wins, and this idea of dealing with food waste feels like a quicker win, because what would be the barriers to a company to take this on? I mean, a little bit of headspace, potentially, maybe allocating it to a green champion, but what are the steps? What would be the barriers, and how is this something that can be overcome relatively straightforwardly without too much engagement from the rest of the company?
Well, you hit the nail on the head when you opened up that question. It is about the headspace issue. So businesses have so many competing priorities right now that kicking off a project to get to zero food waste is not a priority when they are able to throw away that food waste behind closed doors and there's no consequences for that. That's why whilst we continue to sell into businesses, and don't get me wrong, we absolutely are getting traction and signing up new clients every week, the other sort of, I guess, prong to our approach is really citizen action and engaging people, because what can drive food waste up the agenda is when their customers and their employees demand that their employers do that. And people should never underestimate the power of their voice. I would also encourage people to be wary of charity washing, which often happens when I will often challenge a store manager at a local store when I can see perfectly good food being thrown away, and they tell us, we redistribute our surplus food to charities. At that point, most people accept that and step away. But if you then ask them, well, how many of your stores are redistributing to charity? What proportion of your food is redistributed to charity? You start to realize that actually, in most cases, the vast majority of their food is not being redistributed to charity. Some of it is being redistributed to charity. So we've all got to recognize the power that we have by just asking people questions. What is going to happen to that food? Why is it going to waste? Why can it not be redistributed?
And actually, that sense of empowerment in terms of that agency that we actually do have, and it can be so hard to remember when we ourselves are so overwhelmed with the life that we're trying to keep up, which seems to just be getting faster and faster every day. So I guess that ties into, well, what can a business have right away that can show off these efforts? And so we come to storytelling. Now, I know that you, as a founder, are a very strong storyteller. You've always had a very strong brand recognition. The same for Olio. I wonder what you have learned in your time building your business and what you've learned in terms of your messaging. And is there anything that businesses can learn or take from that in order that they can then sell or shout about what they're doing so that they're getting value now as opposed to, it goes in an impact report? There's got to be something they can talk about now. So what have you learned about that storytelling piece, that messaging piece?
So storytelling and messaging is incredibly powerful. We're constantly experimenting with it to figure out what resonates, what lands, what works. Certainly in the early days, I remember Sasha and I were always WhatsApping each other, this word is working really well. This sentence, if you switch it around this way, that's resonating. So you need to be constantly testing and experimenting with your messaging. The macro learning that we have had around messaging in this space is that whilst some people are really, really energized by solving the climate crisis, for most people, that feels too distant, too far off, and it doesn't really engage them. And so we have changed our messaging hierarchy. So we used to talk about the planet first, and then we would talk about people, so the community element, and then we would talk about kind of the personal impact that it has sort of on you. Certainly in the sort of neighbour-to-neighbour sharing, we've flipped that on its head. We talk about how great it feels to share. Then we talk about how you're supporting your local community. And then the planet bit is almost the cherry on the cake. And certainly for businesses, where it's really just focused on people or planet, we have flipped that hierarchy as well. And so now we lead with the people, the impact on communities that redistributing food is having, because that just engages people so much more. Because at the end of the day, the people you're selling into at a business are people, they're real human beings, and they really, really can relate to impact on that human level. And so the planetary bit, all the tons of CO2 and litres of water and car miles off the road, that comes second in the messaging hierarchy.
And of course, because it feels quite distant in terms of impact as well, when you're talking about litres of water, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? So going in with the social aspect.
With the social aspect, and also the beauty of the social aspect is you can then share real human stories and testimonials of the impact that this food had on this individual and their family. And that's incredibly moving and incredibly motivating. And that applies to our team as well. We often will share these heartwarming stories that we've encountered through our work and share it out with the wider team, because it gives you that real motivation to show up to work every single day and try and be your best self.
When you look at, you think about, I don't know if you want to shout out any specific customers, but if you look at the different businesses that you are working with, are there any practical tips of things that they have just done very well? I.e., does it always need leadership to have kind of sponsored it from a kind of a willingness perspective? Mm-hmm. Have you seen it work really well where there's just been an Olio food hero at the bottom at grassroots level pushing it up? Mm. Is it a real mix of the two? What are some of the things that have just worked very well for businesses implementing it and getting to the point where they can show off about it?
So it varies by sector. So for large enterprises, large corporates, like the Tesco's, for example, it is very much a top-down approach. So Tesco are true pioneers in this space, not just in the UK, but globally. And they set themselves a goal back in 2017, I think it was, that they wanted zero food waste stores. And they made that goal incredibly public. They didn't know how they were going to achieve it, but they knew that they had to achieve it. And I think they gave themselves a deadline. I think it was by 2020 or something like that. And they didn't hit that deadline. And they still haven't hit that deadline. But they are working really, really, really hard towards that. And they're very much leading the industry. And that really is about that top-down approach. Whereas we find that in contract catering, so in corporate canteens, for example, the bottom-up approach works incredibly well. So anytime I meet anyone who works at any corporate that has a canteen, I am connecting with them, passing on the information about our service. They are then challenging their facilities management team or taking it to their ESG team or taking it directly to their contract caterer. And we have found that we can go from 0 to a signature on a piece of paper, a contract, in sort of 2 to 3 weeks for a corporate canteen. And within a week or two after that, we can be rolled out and redistributing their surplus food. So it's an incredibly fast cycle from an employee saying, we need to be giving away our food, to that food actually being given away.
And I guess that's where the technology platform has really enabled and scaled that, because of course technology is part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. And you've created an ecosystem where it's very easy for somebody to pick that up. I'd love to understand what you've got planned from a product perspective. What can you tell us without breaking any secrets? What are some of the things you're excited about in terms of functionality within the platform? That might either help us as users in the home, but also with businesses.
So sort of starting off with the businesses, we are in the process of building out a resource that they can use to access all of their data dynamically. So at the moment, they have to come through our account managers, whereas we want to be able to give them dashboards so that they can see their impact and have access to that live, and they can also update the requirements of their particular stores. And we have lots more work as well planned around further integration with the charitable sector and really ensuring that Olio sort of complements the activities there. On the neighbour-to-neighbour sharing piece, we just launched, I lose track of time, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, an event section in the app, which we're really excited about. So we've got a community section where we've got a classic message board area, and we've now launched into there as well events. So that enables anybody to add to the Olio app a local event that is taking place or a virtual event that is related to sustainability and sustainable living. And we've already seen some really, really fantastic feedback around that. Beyond that, we have lots of other exciting things coming up, but I can't tell you guys before we tell our community, so I will have to... My lips are sealed for now.
Well, there you have it. Depending on when you're listening to this, make sure you go and download it and you become part of this community. Now, we are coming towards the end of our session, but before I ask you my very last question, can you give us a sense as to is it a dilemma, like whether you stay within the UK market, whether you expand to Europe, to the States? Like, what is your view in terms of where you can have that impact?
So our ambition has always been global from day one. And sort of the scale of the food waste problem that I alluded to earlier on, it makes very clear why that is the case. At the moment, so we have about 4 or 5 million items are being successfully shared every month on the Olio app. And 10 to 15% of that is taking place outside of the UK, just very organically and very naturally. We, prior to the sort of macroeconomic meltdown that kicked off in 2022, we had just started international expansion, doubling down behind that organic sharing that was happening already. But then we put a stop to that, and we, at the moment, are focusing just on the UK. However, we have a number of conversations underway in international markets. There's 2 scenarios in which we will go international. One is if a large flagship retailer wants to take us to their country. So if they are like a Tesco and they want 0 food waste in their stores. The second scenario is if a government says that they want Olio to operate in their country, either because they're trying to tackle the problem of food waste or trying to tackle the problem of food insecurity.
Well, if you're listening to this podcast and have something along those lines, please get in touch with Tessa. So to close our session and to really bring it back to action, there's going to be lots of people here in the room or lots of people listening to this at some point who will work in a workplace, right? What can be the first next thing that they do to move their organization one step closer to food redistribution?
The very first thing to do is to just ask the question, what happens to this unsold or unserved food at the end of the day? And then if you're told it goes to charity, you then need to ask the follow-up question, which is how much of it goes to charity. And you might well hear stuff about health and safety. Oh, we can't do this because of health and safety. We have an incredibly robust food safety management system that can redistribute every single type of food. So the health and safety argument, unfortunately, is a little bit of a kind of smoke and mirrors that is often used to just ask you to go away, and you just need to persist with asking those questions.
Can I have a show of hands in here? Who has ever asked that question? Fantastic. Oh, very good, very good. Well, thank you. Next time, all the hands are going to go up because everybody's going to go home and make this their first next step of what they're going to do. I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for being here and supporting Earthfest, to anybody here listening to Racing Green, the live version, and of course to Tessa Clarke, founder and CEO of Olio, for sharing such practical, tangible advice and giving us hope as to how quickly that change can come when we all decide to choose agency rather than anything else. So a big thank you to Tessa Clarke. Thank you very much.
Thank you.